Hello, this is Adam Feinberg, and today you are joining us for Harlem Stories. And today I'm joined with my co-host, Mark Becker.
Hey, how's it going, Adam?
All right, doing well. So, we started on our last episode. We were talking about getting to know Central Harlem. It's just such a large topic that, that we had to break it into two different episodes. So in the last topic, we talked about a little bit of the borders. We talked a little bit about some of the historic districts. We talked about, the parks in the neighborhood. So now there's a lot more for us to cover, housing and culture. And culture obviously is a big portion of, what Central Harlem is really all about. And then we'll talk a little bit about some other notable points. So in terms of housing, we've got condos, we've got co-ops, we've got townhouses. There's actually there's some condops too, and we only have one land lease building that I know of. So unlike other parts of the city, that is not exactly a common thing. But one of the things that we do see in terms of commonalities, in terms of housing, the majority of co-ops, when you're looking in Central Harlem, the majority of co-ops are actually in these HDFC or these HDC variants of the HDFC world.
What does that stand for?
So HDFC stands for Housing Development Finance Corporation or a Housing Development Funding Corporation. I'm not quite sure which, but I've seen it as both. And HDC is it's something Housing Development Corporation. So that gives you at least a little bit of a sense. Most condos, on the other hand, they're newer construction ground-up buildings from, let's say, roughly 2000 or the year 2000 or newer. There are some condo conversions of older structures and a few condos built prior to 2000, but that gives you a good sense of how the neighborhood is set up. And then finally, one of the things that Harlem is best known for, it's townhouses. Brownstone and limestone designs, mostly row houses, and I'd say the typical one is probably 15 to 18 feet wide. So giving a little lay of the land there, you can find, some that are narrower. And obviously, those are really narrow homes, but they do exist. And you can find some that are wider, and some of these are grand mansions.
I have a client right now, actually. He's looking specifically for a 20-foot plus townhouse. And so I think that's kind of one of those psychological numbers, right? You're looking for a townhouse, 20 feet plus gets you something that's in sort of a different cachet, so to speak.
Yeah. Those 20-foot wide townhouses, in Harlem, they do exist, but they're not exactly easy to find. What might be, doable in terms of like searches and whatnot. You might also find some that are like corner lots that kind of help, give that, that wider perspective. A few of those corner lots, and there aren't a whole lot of them, but when you do come across them, they offer you a third set of windows, third exposure, if you will. So, that kind of makes the home feel wider. So you start getting away from that psychological component of just focusing on like the 20-foot wide. But, in Manhattan as a whole, typically 20-foot wide is like the gold standard. That's ultimately to account for the loft space of, these grand staircases.
Right.
So, I can certainly understand the desire for the 20-foot wide townhouse. Uptown, there aren't all that many of them. They are kind of difficult to find, but they do exist.
Unicorn.
Yeah, the unicorn. So now we get to the hot topic, the real hot topic, culture in Harlem. And I think this really helps define so much of it. The Harlem Renaissance, it had a massive impact on Harlem culture, and it's so large of a topic, it really deserves its own episode and possibly several episodes on Harlem Stories. But today I just want to provide just a more of an overview level, high level cycle, without getting into all the details, but, give a little bit more of a flavor too. So not pure overview, but a little digging down into that. So, give a little bit of that nightlife and culture, past and present. Harlem's become known globally, largely for its concentration of jazz clubs. Did you want to say something, Mark?
Well, my wife used to work at the Fairway offices. It's since defunct on 125th and the West Side Highway. I always used to walk by the Cotton Club over there.
Oh yeah, and actually, that's leads into our next topic. But that's something that you and I have in common. While your wife worked with those Fairway offices, prior to it being a Fairway, back in the 1970s, it was a meat packing plant, that primary location where you go shopping, and that cold room, that was the meat locker, that they'd store,
Wow.
Everything. And my dad, he came back from his Vietnam War service, going to Baruch as an accounting student, and he was the bookkeeper for that meat packing plant. And, and I guess in a sign of the times from back then, and so very different today, he was the bookkeeper and had, some sort of envelope or portfolio with the day's cash take, and he'd be run out from the gangs, and, he'd be running with the money from the meat packing plant, and, so very, very different today. But I guess both of our families have ties to that location. So very cool. But in terms of like the clubs and going back to that, you've got the Cotton Club, as you just mentioned over there. Now, that is not the original one, but, we'll talk a little bit more about it. There's also a movie that was inspired by the nightclub that came out. So the original Cotton Club, it was open from 1923 to 1940. It was located on 142nd Street in Lenox, and then it wound up moving for a few years to Midtown into the theater district. It operated during Prohibition and the Jim Crow era segregation. Interestingly enough, even though it was based in Harlem, where you had this very large Black population, Black people couldn't initially patronize the club. And even more stunning, the venue featured a lot of Black entertainers such as Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Cab Calloway, Billie Holiday, Lena Horne, and I mean, the list just kept going on and on.
Love me some Billie Holiday.
Billie Holiday is amazing. So the club often served as a hot meeting spot for celebrity nights on Sundays, featuring Jimmy Durante, George Gershwin, Mae West, Irving Berlin, Langston Hughes, Judy Garland. The list keeps going on and on. But
we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, exactly. In 1920, heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson opened an intimate supper club called the Club Deluxe, but a bootlegger gangster took over the club after getting released from Sing Sing and changed the name to the Cotton Club. So Johnson remained club manager, and the bootlegger used the place to sell his beer to the Prohibition crowd. So this is how it became so legendary. Shows were musical reviews with the hopes of becoming successful Broadway shows. The reviews, and this is why it ultimately wound up moving to Midtown at some point. The reviews featured dancers, singers, comedians, variety acts, and a house band. And it was Duke Ellington's orchestra that was the house band for a few years and eventually was replaced by Cab Calloway's orchestra. So yes, when we talk about the Culture Club, we talk about, this rich history. In 1978, an incarnation of the Cotton Club opened on West 125th Street, west of Broadway, and it remains there today. So, the owner and I had, met somebody from the club at the Cotton Club a few years back, and they're like, they insisted we are the original Cotton Club. Now, I don't know what their ties to the original owners were, but that is not the original location of the club, certainly. And the club has moved anyway, at some point to Midtown. So I don't know about their full claim, but certainly it is a different location. Another famous club, the Savoy Ballroom. It was a large ballroom for music and dancing, named after the Savoy Hotel in London. It was located on Lenox between 140th and 141st Street, a block south of the Cotton Club. So there's just one. It winds up becoming like this. Like in New York City, we know that there were districts for everything. There's like the flower district. There was the lighting district. There was a district for everything, and it was no really different in Harlem in terms of nightclubs. So the Savoy Ballroom, Langston Hughes termed it Lenox Ave, the heartbeat of Harlem, and the Savoy was called the world's finest ballroom. It was in operation from 1926 to 1958. It was 10,000 square feet, a block long, and could hold up to 4,000 people. The manager of the Savoy sought to run a luxury ballroom to accommodate the many thousands who wished to dance and in an atmosphere of tasteful refinement rather than the small, stuffy halls and foul-smelling, smoke-laden cellar nightclubs that were more common. The Savoy was modeled after the Roseland Ballroom, and I'm sure many of us longtime New Yorkers remember the Roseland Ballroom.
Sure.
Lots of concerts there from my memory. But unlike the Cotton Club, the Savoy had a no discrimination policy. Patrons were judged on their dancing skills and not on the color of their skin.
Well, I would have been judged, but not for the color of my skin, but for my dancing skills.
Yeah, me too, and not for the better. And then legend has it, one night someone came over and said, "Hey man, Clark Gable just walked in the house." Somebody else said, "Oh yeah, can he dance?" When you come into the Savoy, you were expected to bring the dance, and the skills present were high. So you had to bring your A game. There was no doubt about it. And a form of swing dancing, the Lindy Hoppers had their own section of the dance floor. So this really gives you some flavor of the area. The music, it went nonstop. There was always an alternate band in place when another band had completed its set, and this is, I guess, a nod to the formality of the time. Men didn't enter without a jacket and tie.
Wow.
For a little bit of a premium. And, I think this is kind of a cool thing. You could buy a dance lesson or a professional dance partner for the night. So I thought that was kind of cool. Something that I didn't know before I started researching for this story. But what I did know is legends such as Ella Fitzgerald, Dizzy Gillespie, Benny Goodman, Count Basie were, all, performers are in attendance, at the club. The music went nonstop there, and these legends over here. It just continued until the ballroom shut down in April of 1943 as a result of charges of vice filed by the police department and army, of all places. But the license was renewed by mid-October of 43, so they were only shut down roughly around 6 months or so. But the ballroom went out of business ultimately in October 1958. It was demolished for construction of the Delano Village housing complex in April of 1959. So I guess that, kind of parallels what we've seen, throughout the city over the years. I mean, I remember from the 1980s, I'm old, I get it, I'm officially old, but MTV used to film Club, MTV and MTV Dance, their show at the Palladium, which is now an NYU housing dorm. So how the history kind of repeats itself.
Full circle.
Yeah, full circle. There were lots of other many venues that we can pick up in future episodes that we can talk about. The Rennie, Minton's Playhouse, Lenox Lounge, Small's Paradise. So there's so many of these other, smaller but still important venues that we can discuss as well. But we would be remiss if we went through this episode and in terms of talking about Central Harlem and culture, if we didn't talk about the world famous Apollo Theater. So, it kind of almost owns its own category.
It's showtime.
Yeah, we'll talk about showtime at the Apollo.
Get up on your feet.
Awesome. So the music hall is on 125th Street, noted for African American performers, home to the TV show on New Talent, Showtime at the Apollo, just as you said. And the Apollo is actually in the process of expanding now into part of the Victoria Theater, which has been redeveloped recently. So you're going to have the Victoria Theater and this extension of the Apollo Theater on the lower floors. On the south portion of this new tower that was built above the Victoria Theater, you're going to now have a Marriott hotel. And on the north side of it, you'll have affordable housing. So, very, very much its own, renewed entity, but they've kept the original venue at the ground floor for the Victoria Theater. So one cool thing, but let's talk about a little history of the Apollo. Seating for 1,506 people total and 2,500 people standing. It was built in 1913, originally as the Hertig and Siemens Music Hall, and altered shortly after opening for showing movies. In 1924, it was leased as a theater for burlesque shows. So, a little bit of a blue background there. And in 1934, it became a venue for Black performers and open to Black patrons for the very first time. Today, it's on the New York City Landmark Registry and National Register of Historic Places. About 1.3 million people visit the Apollo Theater annually.
Wow.
On February 14th, now known Valentine's Day, 1934, first major star to appear at the Apollo was jazz singer and Broadway star Adele Hall in Clarence Robinson's product, Chocolate Soldiers with Sam Wooding's orchestra. The show was limited engagement and highly praised by the press, establishing the Apollo's reputation. And fast forward to the 1960s, it was incredibly successful for the Apollo, but in the 1970s, drugs and crime caused it to close in 1976. So every Wednesday from the 1950s to 2000, notwithstanding the period where the venue was shuttered, the Apollo featured Amateur Night in Harlem, and a man with a broom would sweep performers off the stage if the high vocal and opinionated audiences began to call for their removal. And in traditional New York style, audiences let you know their thoughts without hesitation. When have you known a New Yorker to bypass an opportunity not to voice their opinion?
Exactly.
We are loud, we are in your face, and we will not let you, slide by on the little things. So sometimes
the hook.
Yep, the hook. Yeah, a little gong show before the gong show ever came out. But boos were notorious over there. Sometimes a siren or cab gun would serve as a substitute for the broom or the hook. So yeah, there was a pretty rough audience there. So you had to set a high bar to perform there. The Apollo is built as a place where stars are born and legends are made, and this is true. Careers launched at the Apollo, and I can't even begin to go through the list, but here's just a handful over here. Ella Fitzgerald, she launched her career. The Edwards sisters, Luther Vandross, who appeared 5 times and was booed off the stage every time, believe it or not. Wow. Award-winning singer, and yet he got booed off the stage. Jimi Hendrix won the first place prize in an amateur musician contest at the Apollo in 1964. And the Jackson 5, probably the most famous of the people that got launched at the Apollo. Jackson 5s were also winners of the contest at the Apollo, which started their professional career. A few other winners of performers that launched their career. Sinbad, in fact, I heard that he had told his story. I know there's a recording and a video of that, and he was basically like needed to live out of his car to get started, and he took a chance at the Apollo, and he launched his career there. Steve Harvey, Monique, Lauryn Hill, and I guess these are the people that just launched their careers there. But the list of the performers at the Apollo is too long, and there's actually even like the Apollo equivalent of the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Where if you go in there, you'll see like all these stars on the sidewalk, with these stars' names.
Sure.
some of the names, and I'm just going to give you, rattle down the list over here, but I know I'm not including everyone, but Bill Cosby, Richard Pryor, Red Fox, Buddy Rich, Buddy Holly, Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Otis Redding, Billie Holiday, Sammy Davis Jr., James Brown, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Parliament Funkadelic, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Dionne Warwick, Patti LaBelle, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Fat Joe, Mary J. Blige, Benny King, B.B. King, Bob Marley and the Wailers, Michael Jackson without his brothers, Bruno Mars, Guns N' Roses, and apologies to any of the other amazing performers that I didn't list.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of getting into Harvard Law School if you're a performer. Right?
Yeah, seriously.
Write your own ticket.
Yeah, absolutely. The Apollo is like a make or break performance. So, of course, we couldn't talk culture without it. There's also the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is closed. It's actually being rebuilt, and it's kind of like, I want to say, I don't know if it's exactly across from the Apollo, but it's pretty close. But they're getting a whole brand new building. It's an art museum devoted to the work of artists of African descent. The museum galleries are currently closed, and that new construction building is going to be along 125th Street. It was founded in 1968. The museum collects, preserves, interprets, and interprets are created by African Americans, members of the African diaspora, and artists from the African continent. Its scope includes exhibitions and artist in residence programs, educational and public programming, and there's also a permanent collection. The museum is well known for being custodian for an extensive archive of photographer James Vanderzee, who chronicled Harlem during the 1920s to 1940s. So, that's just, another aspect of it. In terms of culture, I think the last thing I want to kind of point out is there are still local restaurants and lounges that will host live music events, often free and very often jazz bands. COVID had halted much of these performances for a while, but we've started seeing a return to it. It's not still back to normal, but we have started seeing a return to that. And, I guess finally, before we wrap up this episode, we just wanted to kind of point out a few other aspects of, that are important to know, just getting to know Central Harlem. There's the Malcolm Shabazz Harlem Market. It's a vibrant indoor-outdoor collection of stalls with vendors selling clothing, arts and crafts, artwork, jewelry, and African masks.
Interesting soap there.
Yeah. I've seen that. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. State Office Building on 125th Street, just down the block from the Apollo. Bill Clinton had set up his office post-presidency here. And finally, and this is, a little controversial because the location and, proposed buildings, but right now Al Sharpton's headquarters for his National Action Network is located in Central Harlem along 145th Street. Now, his location, where his headquarters is based, this is at that controversial site at Lenox and 145th Street, where there was a developer that was going to build, up to 50% affordable housing. And, one of the local representatives still opposed it. It still wasn't good enough after all these concessions. And finally, the developer said, I'm pulling out. And he said, I'm going to build a truck stop there instead, since it doesn't take much to develop there and, create some revenue, while we decide.
Truck stop.
Yeah, truck stop. And that caught the attention of Albany and
18-wheelers driving on 145th.
Well, you got them parking there overnight and, things like that, giving them a chance to rest and, obviously for a paid fee. So that kind of, that process and I guess that project had been on hold, and now they started talks again. Now that local Harlem representative has decided not to rerun for election, and basically with her out of the equation, they figured much more reasonable behavior, and they can actually come to some conclusion. And it's going to be a large tower, but the developer is still sticking to that 50% affordable homes. that just wasn't good enough for that representative. Anyway, so Al Sharpton's headquarters is there, at least for now, and we'll see where it winds up moving, should that project move forward. Subway access for Central Harlem is terrific. You've got the 2, the 3, the A, C, and B trains. And rumor has it that, that the MTA, and this rumor was actually started by the MTA, so, it's just a question whether it's going to come to fruition or not. But the MTA is considering extending the new 2nd Avenue line to connect further west with the 2-3 trains along 125th Street. I'm not going to hold my breath for that, but, hopefully that'd be nice. Filming, lots of filming and TV for TV and movies are filmed here. Just a few examples. There's the show that's named just simply Harlem. There's The Godfather of Harlem, American Gangster, Law and Order SVU, Shaft, Across 110th Street, Superfly, The Cotton Club. I mentioned there was a movie called The Cotton Club. King of New York, Paris is Burning, Harlem Nights, New Jack City, which is actually related to a building that we had talked about, and we talked about the Astors as well. Mm-hmm. And that was the model for what they used as the crack den in New Jack City. Obviously, things have changed quite a lot over the years, but finally, to wrap up, there was Jungle Fever, Sugar Hill, Precious, and I'm sure there's more, but those were the ones I could come up with off the top of my head. Famous people, well, just a few. The list would be way too long. I mean, Harlem is a large geographic span. New York City, there's so many famous people, but names that I was able to find just immediately without digging too hard: Scott Joplin, Vince McMahon, Thomas Nast, who we'll talk about over Christmas time. Norman Rockwell lived there for a while, and he also lived on the block where there's that new development on 103rd, and it's called the Rockwell. Mo Berg, who was famous for Major League Baseball, and he was also a spy. Milton Berle, Georgian and Ira Gershwin, Oscar Hammerstein, first and second, Harry Houdini, who is actually related to a client of mine. Arthur Miller, Arthur Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times, Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson, if you're not familiar with the name, when we talk about the Godfather of Harlem or American Gangster in terms of TV and movies, that was both based off of him, Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy.
Yeah, he was the guy. And actually, New Jack City also kind of featured a rendition of him too, where Bumpy Johnson became famous because even though he was a drug kingpin for the area, he was known for his generosity, and he gave away on Thanksgiving whole turkeys to anybody that wanted them on the street. So we had an entire truckload of turkeys and just distributed to people on the street out of the truck. So, he was known for his generosity, but obviously, not a great character either as well. But a few other names, Sammy Janvis Jr., Ben E. King, Ving Rhames, Doug E. Fresh, who actually had a restaurant as well.
6 minutes.
Curtis Blow, Biz Markie.
But you say he's just a friend.
Yeah. Oh, I love Biz Markie. Billy D. Williams, Maya Angelou had a home in Central Harlem, which we may talk about in a future episode. Bob Dylan, who I had mentioned in the first part of this. Neil Patrick Harris had recently lived and set a record for townhouse sale not too long ago. Mandy Patinkin, Alyssa Reiner, and if you don't know the name, she was in Orange is the New Black, and of course the list goes on and on. But these were just some of the names that I was able to gather. This I think is a kind of a great summary of just getting to know Central Harlem, South Harlem, all its historic districts, its culture. We'll get into so many more aspects of this in future episodes, because I think it's just worth mentioning all of the other clubs. And we obviously talked about a few of the key ones, but there were so many more.
Love it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again for another episode of Harlem Stories.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great one.